Paul would be adult and in the area that he needs to be in order to know that Jesus was a popular figure, even if he was not a direct eyewitness to Jesus.
Hey everyone, so happy to have you here for this one. This is a heavyweight matchup for modern day debate, and the question on the table is whether Jesus actually existed as a real historical person. On one side, you have Dr. Richard Carrier, the well-known academic mythicist, whose books on the historicity of Jesus have made him one of the most cited skeptics on the subject in the world. On the other side is CJ Cox, a young apologist from the Synagogue YouTube channel who comes in defending the traditional Christian view that Jesus was a real flesh and blood person who walked the earth in first century Judea. The debate gets technical, theological, and surprisingly intense. Make sure you watch all the way through this one because there is a moment near the end where one specific concession slips out that completely shifts the weight of the entire conversation, and you do not want to miss how it lands. Quick favor before we jump in, drop a comment letting me know which city or country you are watching from today. It always means a lot to see how far this community reaches. Now let me hit play.
For what I was talking about, yes, a lot of Bible translations have that, but that's not in the Greek. At no point does Paul ever say Jesus is descended from David. Paul says Jesus is manufactured out of the semen of David directly, right? He doesn't say that it's a descent. He doesn't say like it came from Joseph who descended from David. He doesn't say descent at all. He says he basically seems to say that Jesus was directly manufactured out of the semen of David, which I think if you're going to read it literally, I think Paul means that literally. And if he doesn't mean it literally, it's just as likely he means it allegorically, just like he means that we are the seed of Abraham when we're not, right? So even Gentiles are called the seed of Abraham because of a spiritual meaning of that. It's not a literal biological meaning of it. So if he can say that, he could say there could be some sort of allegorical way that Jesus is of the seed of David. Either one. The problem is that Paul doesn't say, right? So we don't know which of these things it is. Is this an obscure roundabout way to refer to descent in the normal biological way? Maybe, but we don't know. Paul doesn't say. And that's the problem, is we don't know. It's so obscure and weird the way Paul is saying this. We don't know what he means. And so we can't actually affirm that he means the thing that we want him to mean, right? And that's the problem with this. And I think we kind of have no way to prove one supposition over another. So we're at a deadlock. We just can't use the evidence because we don't know how to interpret it. And that's the kind of talking about where the text, when you look at the Greek, doesn't look like what historicists presuppose today.
Well, see, I think there's a couple things to be mentioned there. I mean, I do think, first off, just to kind of point out, when you say that he doesn't call the 12 disciples, I think that's actually kind of irrelevant because the 12 is a clear reference to what we would call the disciples. And if it's not, then there has to be some explanation as to what exactly that was. And those disciples are the disciples because they walked with the fleshly Jesus, according to every tradition that we have. In fact, even the early tradition that says that there was, that Jesus didn't actually come in the flesh, which was the Docetists, right? Which is something that we all knew very well, actually. In fact, 1 John is believed to be a polemic against Docetists. But, even in that case, the Docetists did still believe that there was this at least appearance of him being here in the flesh and that the disciples walked with that appearance, right? So that reference presupposes in some way these 12 walking on this planet with a person named Jesus, whether or not he's fleshly, or you could take a Docetist position if you like, although Docetists don't seem to appear until much later in the tradition. I digress on that, though. The point being, that reference to the 12, regardless of if he calls them disciples or apostles or not, that seems to be something that in the historical record, there's only one group that could possibly refer to. And you point out, he says Cephas is different from them. Well, if it's true that Peter is in some way, a chief of the apostles, which I'm not a Roman Catholic by any stretch, but he is said by Paul himself to be at least a chief in some sense, right? He says that James, John, and Peter were pillars of the church, which does seem to give it, and that, also that Peter was given into a ministry of, under the Jews. So he does seem to indicate there is definitely a level of status Peter is afforded. So that, we really only need an explanation that's that simple. And as far as, saying something about it's saying, literally of the semen of David. Well, there are certain Gnostic groups that would come much later, 2nd, 3rd century, and so on, which may have something to say about, that being a thing that's possible. But from the perspective of somebody like Paul, who, once again, according to his own admission in text that me and you both agree would be his words, is a Pharisee of Pharisee, right? That's not something that's going to be in his traditions. That's not something, and that would be at least a major assassination of character, it appears. And frankly, when I hear something like that, the only way I would think you could literally interpret that is as a descendant of David. The only way you could be of the sperm of David, for lack of a better term, is if through his descendants later down the line, you ended up being one of his direct descendants, in this case, one of his direct male descendants.
This right here is where the entire mythicist position starts looking strained, and you have to understand what's actually being argued. Dr. Richard Carrier is sitting across from CJ Cox and trying to convince the audience that one of the most central claims of the New Testament, that Jesus was a real human being descended from King David, is somehow not actually in the text. When Dr. Richard Carrier said this, at no point does Paul ever say Jesus is descended from David. He's making an extraordinary claim. Because Romans 1 verse 3 explicitly says Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh. That phrase has been read as a literal genealogical claim by every major branch of Christianity for 2,000 years. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, every tradition reads it the same way. So when an academic comes along and says, actually the original Greek doesn't say that, you have to ask why every Greek-reading Christian for the entire history of the church missed that. Then Dr. Richard Carrier doubled down with this. Jesus was directly manufactured out of the semen of David, which I think if you're going to read it literally, I think Paul means that literally. Read that one more time. He's seriously suggesting that Paul, a Jewish Pharisee educated in the school of Gamaliel, believed in some kind of cosmic body construction scenario where God reaches down and assembles a body for Jesus in outer space. This is the part that blows my mind. There is nothing in Jewish theology that supports that interpretation. Nothing in rabbinic tradition, nothing in the Dead Sea Scrolls, nothing in the Septuagint. It is a reading invented in the 21st century to support a thesis nobody held before. CJ Cox calmly walked into this with a much simpler reading. He said this, "Those disciples are the disciples because they walked with the fleshly Jesus according to every tradition that we have." This is what people miss about the entire debate. The simplest, most natural reading is the one held by every Christian community in history. The complicated cosmic interpretation is the one that requires you to throw out 2,000 years of consensus. CJ closed part 1 with a clean takedown when he said this. The only way you could be of the sperm of David, for lack of a better term, is if through his descendants, later down the line, you ended up being one of his direct descendants. That's just basic biology. That's how every human being is descended from any ancestor. The fact that CJ has to explain genealogy in the year 2026 to defend a basic reading of Romans tells you everything about how strange Dr. Carrier's position actually is.
Yeah, not if it occurred the way that actually Paul says, that God manufactured a body directly out of the semen of David. And there's actually the Nathan's prophecy in the Old Testament actually says that God is going to manufacture an eternal son of God from, he says, an eternal throne, but there'll be a son who will sit on an eternal throne. He's going to directly manufacture it out of the semen from David's belly. Now, that prophecy was falsified by the fact that the throne wasn't eternal. The throne that resulted actually disappeared for several centuries, or a century at least. And so you can actually look at that and say, like, well, this is a crisis for Judaism. The throne wasn't eternal. How do you get that prophecy to be true? The obvious way is to say, well, that means that there's going to be some other son that God is going to manufacture out of the semen of David, and that son is going to sit in the eternal throne. And that's Jesus, of course, right? That's how you get this logic. And this is totally in line with the Pharisees. The Pharisees were supernaturalists, unlike the Sadducees, who are anti-supernaturalists. the Pharisees were all into all this kind of stuff. I mean, and Paul himself talks about there's our resurrection bodies are empty, like empty shells are waiting for us in heaven to be occupied. Paul got to visit the third heaven and visit the Garden of Eden in the third heaven and talk to angels. I mean, there's Paul is clearly a supernaturalist. Like, he has no problem with these kind of weird cosmic concepts. So that isn't the case. And I do have to correct you on one thing, though, that Paul says he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He rejected Phariseeism for Christianity. So he actually found the more fringe views of Christianity more attractive than Phariseeism. So you really can't cite his Phariseeism necessarily. But even as citing it, they were the supernaturalists among the Jewish sect. So they're actually quite in line with what we're talking about. And when you talk about the 12, I want to point out that the Qumran community before Christianity, a century before Christianity, they had a quorum of 12. We have references to it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in Dead Sea Scrolls that show a sect that has teachings very similar to Christianity before Christianity came along. So when Paul says he appeared to Peter and the 12, it sounds like we're looking at a sect of Christians led by Peter who had this revelation of Jesus, and then his quorum of 12 had a confirming, they had confirming revelations themselves, and that started the religion. So that's just like Mormonism, basically, right? You have Joseph Smith, and you have the eyewitnesses, and then you have Brigham Young, and so on. It's the same storyline in many ways, right? That's why it's significant when Paul doesn't say that they're disciples. He doesn't say they ever met Jesus. He doesn't say they were handpicked by Jesus. And he says that they're just apostles, and apostles are people who have a revelation of Jesus. It sounds like that's the only thing Paul knows about is disciples. What we mean by disciples, he means people who were apostles who had revelations of the Lord. And so it sounds like that's what Paul's talking about. And when you can't connect it to the Gospels except if you presuppose that Paul's talking about what's in the Gospels. But the Gospels, if they're written after, they're deliberately trying to reify what Paul talks about and turn it into a history. So they're actually taking the Council of 12 and turning it into a group of people that Jesus handpicks in life. And so you can't establish that it's the other way around, right? So that's the problem, is that we can't use questionable documents to reinterpret the more reliable documents that we have.
The moment Dr. Carrier brought up Nathan's prophecy, you could feel the argument start to twist itself into knots. He said this: God is going to manufacture an eternal son of God from, he says, eternal throne, but there will be a son who'll sit on an eternal throne. He's now arguing that because the Davidic throne disappeared for a while, Paul must have invented a celestial son to keep the prophecy alive. But here is what makes this strange. Christians have always understood the eternal throne prophecy in 2 Samuel 7 as fulfilled through Jesus reigning at the right hand of the Father. That's basic Christian theology. You don't need a cosmic construction scenario to make the prophecy work. Then Dr. Carrier tried to redefine Paul's own self-identification. He said this: Paul says he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He rejected Phariseeism for Christianity. Read that twice. He's claiming Paul rejected being a Pharisee. But Acts 23 verse 6 has Paul standing before the Sanhedrin years after his conversion declaring, "I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees." Paul never abandoned his Jewish identity. He always saw Christianity as the fulfillment of Pharisaic theology, not a rejection of it. So when CJ uses Paul's Pharisaic background to argue against the cosmic interpretation, it's actually a very strong move because Paul's Jewish framework cannot accommodate Dr. Carrier's reading. Here is the part where Dr. Carrier really stretches things. He said this: the Qumran community before Christianity, a century before Christianity, they had a quorum of 12. That's true. The Essenes did have councils of 12, but that doesn't help Dr. Carrier's case at all. The existence of a Jewish council of 12 doesn't somehow erase the fact that the New Testament documents specifically name 12 disciples of Jesus, give us their stories, and present them as historical figures. The Qumran parallel is interesting historical context, but it doesn't establish that Paul's reference to the 12 in 1 Corinthians 15 is anything other than what every Christian community has always understood it to be. Then Dr. Carrier dropped the analogy that I think actually undermines his own case. He said this. That's just like Mormonism, basically, right? You have Joseph Smith, then you have the eyewitnesses, and then you have Brigham Young. This is fascinating because in Mormonism, Joseph Smith was a real flesh and blood person. The eyewitnesses were real flesh and blood people. The whole structure presupposes a historical founder and a historical succession. So the analogy actually proves CJ's point. Religious movements with 12-member councils tend to be founded by historical people, not by celestial beings transmitted through visions. The Mormonism analogy works against the mythicist position once you actually think about what it implies.
Because those questionable documents are trying to push a certain narrative that doesn't appear in the earlier documents. And that's the problem that I'm looking at when I say that Paul never mentions disciples, he never calls the 12 disciples, and he never says they're handpicked by Jesus in life. He never says anything like that. Now, if he did, had he done so, then this wouldn't be a debate. We would both agree that Paul's talking about the same guy, at least in some mundane sense, that gets embellished in the Gospels.
Well, I mean, I think he presupposes it. I think the fact that he references the 12 in such an offhand way almost presupposes that these people are the people as described in the Gospels. And of course, as I said earlier, I do definitely believe that, the Gospels have an earlier date. In fact, I would even kind of point out that in a lot of ways, some of this stuff only kind of makes sense if the Gospels have an earlier date. Like for, how does he know exactly? Well, unless, of course, he personally knew them, which, to be fair, he does claim he did. So I guess I'll retract that statement. But nonetheless, you know what I mean? He does certainly seem to have not only him, but also everybody who he's speaking to an implicit knowledge of this 12 and their status such that doesn't need an actual explanation. I would point out that this is a very early writing. In fact, most of Paul's writings are relatively early, all things considered. And Paul, it's widely believed Paul was born sometime around the year 5. You can give or take 10 or 15 years. I really don't mind. The point is, Paul would be adult and in the area that he needs to be in order to know that Jesus was a popular figure, even if he was not a direct eyewitness to Jesus. And being that he was a Pharisee, which is the group which is accusing Jesus, and ended up being one of the chief persecutors afterwards, according to his own admission in one of his earliest works, it does seem relatively likely that even if he was not an eyewitness of Jesus, which I don't think he was, that he would certainly be somebody who, has at least enough knowledge to confirm whether or not this person physically existed.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a valid point if Paul ever clearly referenced Jesus being a historical person walking around the earth, right? I agree. If that was all we had was Paul talking about, well, I heard these stories from these guys who knew Jesus when they walked with him in Galilee and so on, then it would be a no-brainer. Yeah, we would have, that would definitely count as evidence for the historicity of Jesus, and I think it would be well established in that case that Jesus existed. The problem is that Paul never does that, right? That's the problem. Yes, he's a contemporary, but that's what's weird. A contemporary should be talking about the historical narrative, the biography and life of Jesus a lot more than he does. And that's why I have a doubt.
Oh no, this is the part where the entire mythicist case starts collapsing under its own weight, and you can almost see Dr. Carrier realize it as it happens. CJ Cox laid the foundation by saying this: in a lot of ways, some of this stuff only kind of makes sense if the Gospels have an earlier date. Now hear me on this. If the Gospels are early, every single major argument the mythicist makes falls apart. Early Gospels mean closer to eyewitness accounts. Closer to eyewitness accounts means more reliable historical attestation. More reliable historical attestation means Jesus was a real person walking around in real places, interacting with real Jewish authorities. The early dating debate is everything for this conversation, and CJ knows it. Then, CJ delivered the timeline knockout. He said this: Paul would be adult and in the area that he needs to be in order to know that Jesus was a popular figure, even if he was not a direct eyewitness to Jesus. This is the part most people don't realize about Paul. He was not some isolated mystic writing in a vacuum. He was born around 5 AD. He was an adult during Jesus' ministry. He was a member of the Sanhedrin's enforcement apparatus. He was the chief persecutor of the early Christian church. If anyone in the ancient world was positioned to know whether Jesus was a real human being or a celestial myth, it was Paul. Then CJ closed the trap with this: that he would certainly be somebody who you know has at least enough knowledge to confirm whether or not this person physically existed. There is no escape from this. Either Paul, the most relentless persecutor of Christianity, somehow missed that the Jesus he was persecuting people over was a celestial fiction, or the simpler explanation is true, and Jesus was exactly who Christians have always claimed him to be, a real human being who lived, taught, died, and rose again in first century Judea. And then Dr. Carrier did the most revealing thing in the entire debate. He said this: contemporary should be talking about the historical narrative, the biography and life of Jesus, the way a lot more than he does. Stop. Read that one more time. Dr. Carrier just admitted that Paul was in a position to talk about the historical Jesus. He just admitted that Paul should have been able to confirm Jesus' biography. That admission is fatal to the mythicist case, because once you concede Paul was contemporary and had access to the relevant information, the only remaining question is what counts as Paul talking about Jesus' earthly life. And Paul absolutely does talk about it. He references Jesus being born of a woman, born under the law, descended from David, betrayed in the night he was handed over, crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. The argument that Paul doesn't talk about Jesus enough collapses the moment you actually read Paul's letters with fresh eyes. Here is some context most people don't get. The historical method used to confirm any ancient figure requires multiple lines of attestation, contemporary witnesses, and continuity of tradition. Jesus has all three. The Gospels were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. Paul was a contemporary persecutor turned apostle. The early church fathers like Ignatius of Antioch and Clement of Rome, both writing within decades of the events, affirm a historical Jesus. Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of John, affirms a historical Jesus. The chain of transmission is unbroken. The fact that Dr. Carrier has to invent a complex cosmic interpretation to escape this evidence tells you exactly how strong the historical case actually is. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.